When my great teacher, A.T. Davison, states in his Elson lecture of 1953 that the text must be for the composer the animating source of his whole creation, and he must constantly be intent on mirroring every shade of meaning and emotion resident in the words. When he said that, we were colleagues, and I had studied in his famous seminar in choral composition and the ferocious music history seminar, which laid low so many would-be scholars. While he was composing this lecture in Brant Rock, I was living with my newborn son Christopher and my wife in Davison's winter home in Lincoln, near Boston. It was the summer where the Davisons had turned over their stunning Stubbins house, a showpiece of domestic architecture, for a 3-month period. The birth of Christopher, the impact of being set free in the great house, and the library of my mentor, and the welling up of happiness in my life all combined to lead to the setting of The Lady and the Lute, which you've just heard so eloquently and brilliantly performed by Nelga Lynn Dinnerstein and my wife. I devoured the books I could find, books which were laid all around and reflected not only the life of the professional scholar, but the habits and tastes of Alice Davison, who has served for so many years at Harvard University Press as a principal editor in music. Well, I had first encountered Herrick in a way not uncommon to the restless and curious young boys, and I unearthed it in a trunk in the attic, where these slim volumes of the Hesperides had been put away, presumably safe from young and eager and restless eyes. Well, the volumes were bound in a brown calfskin, mid-19th century collector's edition, I should presume. The printing had those irritating S's and which looked like F's, or F's which looked like S's, I never can remember. And there were some mildly erotic copper plates of sylvan scenes, and presumably of Julia and her sisters. All this was sufficiently stimulating to a press at age 8 or so, and Herrick, as a very particular fellow, who had probably written other poetry even more exciting than The Vine. But in the summer of 1952, I can't even recall if I truly had that earlier discovery in mind. I was looking for a set of pieces for a particular singer, an unusual and quite gifted student who was in all my classes when she bothered to attend, and who had a voice of remarkable clarity, though it was very, very small and clearly not professional in caliber. What she had was absolute pitch, and I thought that a set of pieces which would be written for her could at least be performed. In those days, one despaired of finding singers to do new music. There were plenty around Cambridge doing Bach cantatas. One in particular was my good friend Phyllis Curtin, who definitely was not going to do these songs. And such, but not Baird, Faburn, and Schoenbeck. Well, Jean Lunn, the young singer, was one of those students too smart by half, too spread out, too complicated in her aims to settle in anything, but she would do the songs and had asked for some. So did the work of reviving some of the poems I had been tucking away. At first I turned to Marble and to Donne, having set one of Donne's marriage songs as a wedding present for my sister the year before. Well, I quickly found the Herrick and immediately knew that the texts in a volume of his work were right for me at the time. It took only a few days to establish the collection of 8 poems, all unified in tone, marked by common streaks of delicious and insinuating sensuousness, save only number 7, The Curse, which seemed an appropriate foil for all the lusciousness. Well, the finding of text is a kind of art in itself. One has a limitless supply, and for me, the first decision in writing songs is some thematic connections, some overlapping of images, some words which can be treated the same or differently. What's hard to explain, and I can only call it part of the process, is the instantaneous way I know whether a poem is settable, by me, that is. Now, there are innumerable poems I love which I would never think of setting. Most of Shakespeare, for example, all of Pope, most of Baudelaire, all of Rilke. And I can't give adequate or coherent reasons for these feelings. But in general, I find much contemporary poetry in little need of setting, only diminished by music, only needlessly complicated by sounds. Now, I realize this is quite a personal and indefensible and odd position. and I don't carry it over into my teaching or my advising of students who often come in these days with at least some Sylvia Plath. What I can perhaps say with feeling is that the connection to Herrick, to Donne, to Blake, to Carew, to the delicious epigrams of the 17th century is quick for me and has proven a delight and an appetizing challenge many times over. Professor Davison, in his usual simple and blunt way, lays out the kind of attitude which I feel works best in setting text. You try to discover what is there, whether from a semantic, a purely sonorous, a metric, rhythmic cast, a determination of the structure of the poem and how it can be transformed to music. You try and find what it is you think you can add. And my own feeling is that one had better be very certain about that, about the business of adding something. Now, there are great composers such as Britten or Schubert or Duparc who seem to be able to take almost any text and create wonderful music. All I can say is that I have very special limitations, I suppose, and much more limited approaches. What is it then, to ask one of the obvious questions, and you remember the title of these series of lectures is Obvious Questions and Impossible Answers. One of the obvious questions which leads me to a text, makes me know at once that it's right, that it's, well, I think it's first of all some central image, maybe a collection of images, maybe a composite. But at once, there must be some registration on me of that image. It hooks me at once into a connection to the text, and from that point on, I start to build my approach, to tear into it gently, to lift out this sinew or that, to push aside this vesicle or that, to lay out the network of associations. For example, in the first poem and the last, and hence the connection of these two and the title of the set, there are mentions of the lute. The lute for me and for most musicians is a rich word, a referent to a whole series of pictures of an instrument and often a beautiful performer in the iconography of 15th to 17th century art. It's very sound, pure, musical, resonant in itself, a word which invites the composer. That it is a musical instrument of wondrous variety, shapeliness, and delicacy is another point. Then there's the word melting. Melting is for me an irresistible image, whether a literal melting of snow to heat or metal to fire, or as a metaphor for the breaking down of resistances. The word has immediate musical charm. Mind, I realize perfectly well that this is describing the most personal of attitudes and that other composers would find not the least attraction in those words, turning rather to melodious or to amber. All I can do is to struggle with this issue, calling up from almost 30 years ago the instincts which led me to this first stage of writing the pieces. Then there is the tone of poetry that one wishes to set. Here, the poetry is about beauty, physical beauty, delicate and rich and sensuous, very suggestive, yearning. Scenes in the boudoir, scenes of intimate study, scenes of the dressing table. And at the same time, there's a marvelous tone of irony, of delicate and wry restraint. There are conceits, exquisitely forged conceits. This led me to a second stage of composing, the overlay of musical apparatus, which would clarify the wryness and increase the irony. What more delightful, or so I thought, than to encase the snail-like march of her pretty feet in a pompous Endelian passacaglia, full of double dottings in the Laws or Purcell style. What more amusing than to embrace a sweet disorder of the dress in a corset of rigid isometric construction, reminiscent rather of the ballades and virelais of Machaut than the tender lyrics of Campion. What better way to liquefy the silks of the splendid Julia than through a repeated, almost monotonous phrase which explodes in a cascade of falling, viscous notes? Well, these are my conceits, my additions, which do no violence, I hope, but which speak to the perceived quality and tone in the poetry, that which is behind the words. In other words, the poetry can be given a setting, as a jewel is set by a jeweler in a mounting, which enhances it, we hope, not seldom by disclosing new facets. At first, I thought of this cycle for voice as a cycle for voice and harpsichord, though it was first played on the piano in the summer of 1952, while I held my 2-month-old son in my arms and heard through the balcony door the music sung well and accurately, if not richly and sensuously. Certainly nothing like this. The first performance with harpsichord, George Crumb played the harpsichord, by the way, should have worked, but it didn't. It was clear that the color, and particularly the harmonic nature of the keyboard part, required a sustaining instrument. And especially if one thought of a reasonable hall, there was simply not enough bite. Still, I've often wondered if the decision to revert to piano was entirely wise. I think so, but it's a fact that this work has had a kind of double life. Sounds very different with harpsichord, of course. The relation of keyboard and voice is always a fascinating part of untangling and of writing songs. What is enough and what is too much? When does the piano smother? When does the balance of musical interest tip unwisely? Is there a perfect fusion? Is there a realm of principles which I could talk about in general or in connection with this work? Well, I hope that the work comes over to you as a joint, fused, inseparable piece with no thought of piano accompaniment or of vocal obligato. It's a cycle for voice and piano. If I had a model, it was probably the Dichterliebe, or maybe the Frauenliebe und Leben, though there is no narrative aspect to my piece. Well, this concept requires, it seems to me, the most careful and musically intelligent kind of collaboration, or the work loses scale. I recall a performance of this piece in Rome by a wonderful singer who completely infatuated me, a real principessa in a Renaissance palace, who wanted to do the songs, who sang them as vehicles, sort of operatic vehicles, shushing up the piano, which she regarded as elegantly made, but unnecessary effulgent. Selina, I remember her name. Her very name reminds me of a kind of performance which was very effective, but in the final analysis, all wrong. I feel sure that the textures of the Berg early songs and the Schoenberg Book of the Hanging Garden and the Hindemith Life of Mary, particularly in the 1922 version, were all in my consciousness. Well, from this 30-year vantage point, the work doesn't have any excessive difficulties. In 1952, it was a very problematic piece, with few hopes of accurate rendition, frustrating intonation questions, and above all, questions of musical meaning. Why set Robert Herrick, a kindly if lascivious 17th century priory dean, in the serial style? Well, that was another of my conceits. I wanted to master the serial style and make it work for me as a whole series of surprises and harmonic sequences which constantly recall the most agreeable tonal styles. In fact, I think of this work as being entirely in C. Not always, but as being built around C. Much of the notation was itself a puzzling problem. Now, all composers who write in this serial bias, but who wish to be expressive in terms of leaps and intervals and jumps, melodies, find sooner or later ambiguities, paradoxes, unpleasant or illogical choices. Since in this piece I was actively thinking in terms of chords and keys and progressions which made differences of A sharp and B flat very important, I would find over and over again that the full major third F sharp to A sharp was putting me into a terrible dilemma if I wanted to go to yet another major third, A sharp, B flat to D. One can make these enharmonic exchanges, but then again, if one wishes to reserve the possibility of enharmonic exchange in the real sense, one is robbed of a resource. Well, this is all technical sounding, and as you know, in these evenings, I've tried very much to stay away from technical musical commentary and stay with common sense English. But the symbolic part of the writing of this piece was a part of the whole problem for me. I was working on trying to find a language, and it became a very difficult question. I think I've solved it, and I think the piece works, certainly in this extraordinary performance. Well, about the time I was composing The Lady and the Lute, the remarkable French composer Pierre Boulez was working on Le Marteau sans Maître, Le Marteau sans Maître, a cycle of songs to text by René Char. This is the text which Stravinsky This is the work which Stravinsky described as probably the only really significant work, his own aside, in his mid-1950s consciousness. It has, in fact, been a monument of the post-war style. Boulez's first wholly successful piece, it seems to me, and still illustrative of many of his great techniques, though he's moved to realms of far greater sensation and expressivity. Now, the reason for bringing up this Boulez work is that there's a fine essay about it by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, which appears in an issue of The Row, a periodical devoted to contemporary music. And the article is entitled Music and Speech, and since that's very much the subject of these comments this evening, I thought it would be worth stopping on. Stockhausen takes the Boulez work as a point of departure for a discussion of some general problems of setting texts. And I've been speaking about these, and here's what Stockhausen says. It's therefore necessary for the listener to comprehend the sung words of the Boulez piece as French language, and to hear the added voice in this context. The musical treatment of the text, keeping close to speech, results in 4 clearly distinguishable categories. 1, parlando, almost identical with colloquial speech, tone and speed intimated freely. 2, quasi parlando, moving curve of the pitch, duration of syllables and intensity fixed. 3, syllable song, all parameters proportionally exactly fixed. 4, melismatic singing. The musical parameters become dominant, more tones than syllables. The voice makes use also, Stockhausen continues, of a 5th category, without altering the timbre, which defines to a great extent relevance in speech, and thus closely approximates the bass flute and viol. The singer sings without opening her mouth, and in le marteau, the 5th vocal form, bouche fermée, closed mouth, of course, leads abruptly to the sphere of pure music. It's an interesting article, and it goes on to discuss the relations of speech and music and the way they can be blurred. This is a description of vocal writing which would fit songs of Berio, Nono, Martirano, and many another composer who followed some of these tenets. And they've begun to treat the voice and words sung by the voice in far more variegated and elaborated ways than one finds in the Second Viennese school or certainly in the more conservative Anglo-American styles. If one were to look into the Busotti or Kagel or Stockhausen works of the 60s, one finds these notions pushed to even further extremes. In Le Passion selon Sade of Busotti, or Sur scène of Kagel, or Momenta of Stockhausen, one finds an atomization of texts into phonemes, that is, short acoustical units, pure speech sounds, and the whole apparatus of speech, song, noise, leading to electronic manipulation of sounds. Well, having participated in, or having caused to be performed, these 3 works I mentioned, the Passion according to Sade of Busotti, the On Stage, Sur scène of Kagel, and the Momenta of Stockhausen, I can really attest to the extraordinary brilliance and excitement of that approach to setting texts, which is reductionist and accretional, ending up with a whole new kind of vox humana, as it were. Now, the most widely performed music of this general type, though perhaps less aggressively flamboyant, is that of Penderecki, who seems rather conspicuously to have managed to atomize word sounds, but to have preserved a context, a frame of meaning which makes his huge choral works more communicative to general audiences, or dramatic works, quite possibly. And I, the poet, I said, yes, poetry has its use, and I will make it. I will make it plain, aspiring to music. Like the poet William Yeats, I will make it from my pleasure and my pain. Well, those 4 lines are take us back to more basic considerations in this quatrain of Mac Hammond, a former colleague of mine, fine poet. And Mac, in his 4 of Us Were Quarreling, uses the phrase aspiring to music. And the phrase aspiring to music, in the context that he's using it, speaking about poetry, is one of the problems in this whole issue of setting words to music. Or T.S. Eliot's remarks drawn from the Spencer Lecture of 1950, as he says, "It's a function of all art to give us some perception of an order in life by imposing an order upon it." And Eliot continues, "We can never emulate music because to arrive at the condition of music would be the annihilation of poetry, and especially of dramatic poetry." I remember Mr. Eliot delivering this lecture and John Finley's lovely party afterward at the Society of Fellows, in which Mr. Eliot had kind words to say about my 5 landscapes, settings of 5 poems which I'd done the year before and which were closely related to his 4 quartets. I was very upset. It was very strange to see this great master of versification and drama, the man who had such aspirations for himself in these plays in verse, that he could have said that music was not capable of emulation. It set me off for many weeks. What I think he was trying to get at was the very point that I was myself trying to explain in the ways I went about finding my verses, in the ways I set them. It's a thirsty search, and once the prey is found, very satisfying. He wants serious purpose and craft mastery, of course, but he's content to separate the poetry and the world of music. And alas, so many times we composers, unlike Mr. Eliot, must try to wed them. The composer who has taught me the most about setting text, from whom I've learned the most, is Virgil Thomson, who has been a close friend for 30 years and has helped me to peace and understanding about these matters in which he is expert and I apprentice ever on. While thinking last summer about these lectures, I went over all Gertrude Stein's work, including The Mother of Us All and 4 Saints and 3 Acts and many of other wonderful plays. And then I went to Virgil's settings. What a revelation, what a continuing revelation. How easy it seems, how remarkable to take the apparently meaningless, as Pierre Boulez did in Le Marteau, and invest it with grace, with charm, with pathos, with intelligence, with mystery. Never one misstep in the prosody, never a false note in the metric, never a banality in the phraseology. We can hear pigeons on the grass, alas, and take it as the ode it is and marvel in the rationality of it, while underneath the craft of a person whose life has been the mixing of words and music reigns on. It is not so much the meaning of the text in which he is interested, it is the fact of it, the essence of it, the persona, which once he chooses a view, he makes his own by a kind of incredible reagent application. He places against the text some sort of catalyzing substance. The simplest chord progressions are the merest touch of an allusion to a particular musical style. And then the text, once odd and dull and empty, becomes vibrant with new meaning. And then, of course, there is always Nadia. Nadia has died recently. The greatest lady of the musical scene is gone, but we here, her myriad American students, continue always to come to her merciless standards. She introduced me to Couperin, Charpentier, Campra, and finally to Rameau. I remember her on the dismal train from Philadelphia to Baltimore, where I had my lessons with her, asking me if I knew much about Rameau. I sheepishly replied that I'd looked at some of the keyboard music. She asked me about the operas. I remembered the great big green volumes and the names, Castor et Pollux, Les Paladins, Hippolyte et Aricie, but had to confess that outside the names, I knew them not. Ah, she said, then you must become familiar with them, for your music is not rhythmically plastic enough. She didn't say rhythmically plastic, but that's what she meant. It was something about the lines being too concentrated, not free enough. Well, it was not till much later that I came to appreciate the greatest of the French composers and to find in Hippolyte the greatest of the French operas, equaled only by Pélias, at its most elegantly produced. She was right. I needed to understand what Rameau could do with a text. But she was paying me too much respect at the time, because I was nowhere near ready to appreciate the majesty of this master of text and music. But again, as with Virgil Thomson, the essence of it all was an understanding and trying to learn more about the flow of language, of being able to assimilate the pace and current, and then give in music some sort of transcending presentation. What, though, is the most elusive problem in setting texts? So one has learned the secrets of language and has understood the special properties which make a song of Fauré or of Rachmaninoff or of Purcell so inimitable. What more must be known? The impossible answer is that one must learn to understand silence. Words and music may go together in synchronous and non-time related forms, in tangent and fused forms, in ways as numerous as the devices of language and music, including all the array of distortions and juxtapositions which could exhaust a year of studies. But I feel that Christina Rossetti has somehow found it out when she says, "Silence more musical than any song." The greatest songs, and the condition toward which every composer of songs strives, it seems to me, is the perception and conveyance of silence. It's in the crevices between the moments, the edges on the events, the spaces which do not fit in the sections we've hooked together, the times of emptiness which we call silence, but which are really music of another order. I feel that The Lady and the Lute, these songs you've heard tonight, make a good stab at this matter of silence. There are blank spots, more than occasions to breathe, more than modest inflections. They are the very music behind the music, the elusive openings to finding out what has resulted in the mixture. If one were to put it negatively, one could attack a good deal of contemporary music, especially for its failure to understand silence. John Cage has been the wisest student of silence, and though he's ingenuous about it, it's clear that even from a failed work of his like the String Quartet, it seems to me that he has grasped what very few composers since Beethoven so clearly understood. The silences of the B-flat Quartet, Opus 130, and the agonizing moments of silence in the C-sharp minor Quartet, Opus 131, which are silent, terrifying moments of anguish, in which the music is there, but the sounds are not. Many of us know the easy definition of music by Cage, sounds and silences, taken over as the title of a lovely anthology of poetry compiled by Richard Peck. But that's too easy. The silences are not measured by a chronometer, not by the stopwatch, which Robert Ashley or Gordon Mumma or Morton Feldman used in order to spread time as if by using some forceps. The silences in songs are the silences which Saint-Exupéry feels in the air, which Hilary felt at 6 miles, which Conrad felt on the sea, which Hawthorne felt in the old houses of Salem, which Lovecraft felt in the presence of overwhelming horrors. Emily Dickinson wrote, "Great streets of silence led away to neighborhoods of pause. Here was no notice, no dissent, no universe, no laws." Neighborhoods of pause, as that begins to say it pretty clearly. I assure you that I'm not trying to flee my subject nor to retreat into some, literary obscurity. I really believe that there is an element which has to be much more part of our consciousness when we listen to a song, and of course when we write it. All the silences, and I think there are many, many kinds of silence. That's the problem. No one has given us a treatise on silence, save perhaps St. John of the Cross. And no composer likes to give away his trade secrets about silence. We do know more about the powerful uses of silence in the grand orchestral literature, perhaps, but I think there's a special kind of silence in the wrenchings of words as they twist into the torque of musical settings. That's part of it. Music is not underlaid, nor added, nor supplied as a kind of polychroming, to words. It involves turning, as on a lathe or a milling machine. The words are placed in context where the lubricant is a new resource. And of course, I'm not forgetting for a minute that poetry is itself full of silences, and that one of the greatest counterpoints of all is the friction of opposed silences, which sometimes, as in the cancellation of waves of light, augment and sometimes diminish moments of energy and understanding. To try and say it more simply, silence is infinitely more than the absence of sound. It's a presence of resonances and accumulated musics. It's an affirmation of human needs for rest. I was amused in looking up silence in the Appel and Daniel Harvard Dictionary. I always do that just for fun, see what's there, and found merely the phrase, French, rest. In this great work, which spares no effort to give us information, this one topic which we are least in the know about is left with one bare word. Obvious questions and impossible answers. The title of this series was never more apt than at this point. No one, save perhaps a theologian, a Hans Kuhn, can tell us more about silence in music. I mentioned the other evening the silences in the meeting house in my 5 years at a friend's school. A silence never tranquil, never quiet, never free of compulsions, broken only by the giggles of other boys and the lamentable oratory of self-designated elders. But I am sure that somehow my preoccupation with silence has origins back there in that rather cold meeting house in Lansdowne. My most unpleasant hour was, by the way, in an anechoic chamber, where silence was not what I'm talking about at all. It was merely a chance to feel one's body, dreadfully magnified in all its physical symptoms. Robert Herrick knew a lot about silence, as you can tell from his wonderful phrase, "I wish I might turn all to ear, to drink in notes and numbers, such as blessed souls can't hear too much." When you stop to ask what notes and numbers mean, you might work out that he's talking about the sounds and the pauses which reveal and illuminate the voice, the silvery voice, with its power so great as to melt down, transform into a lute. I think most pastoral poets knew, Catullus did, Horace certainly, Theocritus perhaps. Need I remind everyone that it's from interior silence that music comes in the first place? We composers have stimuli of every sort, but we must make ourselves silent before we start to compose. If we do not, we create a music somehow tainted, less pure, less ourselves, and probably less true. It's the quest for silence so as to find the notes and numbers which makes us somehow understand St. John when he speaks of a half hour of silence at the opening of the seventh seal. Or we might think about what Tristram Coffin describes when he writes of how a man comes to understand the small language of the flies when he has lost his wife in a silent house. Searching for the right text, yes, but once found, there must be the silences out of which the words and music are melded together. Well, in this time, in this age, we're very hard-pressed to make our way inward to silence. But as I conclude, wishing that we could have another performance of The Lady in the Lute, listening for notes and numbers, but we'll have instead a performance of my third piano sonata, I want to express at this moment my very deepest respect for Louis and Louise Nippert for their endowment, which has made this series possible, and my own hope that it somehow begins a tradition in which the College-Conservatory makes its contribution to the university and the community concerned with obvious questions and their impossible answers. Or in a word, with the quest for ever deeper understanding about what we try to do here.